Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 9 and the narrative of Jacob's sojourn when he's in Haran. This is part of our continuing study in the book of Genesis. Genesis 29:1, Then Jacob went on his journey. This is after his vision of the ladder ascending to heaven. He went on his journey and came to the land of the sons of the east. This is going to be at Haran. He looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it, for from that well they watered the flocks. Now the stone on the mouth of the well was large. This is an interesting description. When all the flocks were gathered there, they would then roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. Apparently, to protect the well, they had a large stone, and they'd wait until everybody was there. And we're told, notice there was a separate stone to say it was a big stone. Well, Jacob gets there. Jacob said to them, "My brothers, where are you from?" And they said, "We're from Haran." And he said to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" And they said, "We know him." And he said to them, "Is it well with him?" Specifically, he's asking, how is his peace? Is it peaceful with him? How's his well-being? And they said, "It is well." And by the way, here's Rachel, his daughter, coming with the sheep. While his eyes were still speaking with him, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Usually you'd have the younger person doing that. This was sort of the menial job. When Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Now, notice how much ink already has been given to that. Big stone, and it was really large. And so here's Jacob, and we usually have pictured Jacob perhaps as an indoors guy, while Esau was the outdoors guy. But here, Jacob acts the part of the manly man, and he rolls this great stone, this large stone, from the well. Sort of reminds me of how in the New Testament another stone was rolled away so that we could come and be romanced by the Savior. Well, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves there. But there is a motif going on, and I've mentioned that already when we were looking at the story of Rebekah, the steward of Abraham meets Rebekah, and that was by a well, not just by a well, probably by this same well. Now, there was no stone mentioned in that story, but here Jacob meets Rachel by the well, and the next time we see a guy meeting a girl by the well, it's going to be Moses, who meets Zipporah by a well. And by that time, there's a motif set up. The guy meets the girl, and it's by the well, and they marry, and they live happily ever after. So that we notice the well isn't even mentioned, but when Boaz meets Ruth, we know it's by a well because Boaz refers to the water jars that are drawn by his servants. And finally, we get to the New Testament, and we see Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman by a well. And that's a romance too, but that's a spiritual romance, not a physical one. And so we're romanced as well. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. Now, this isn't a romantic kiss because he's going to kiss Laban in just a minute. That's just the Middle Eastern way of doing that. Jacob told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. And again, history is repeating itself, because back in Genesis 24:28, we're told about how when Rebekah had first met the servant of Abraham, that she had ran and told her mother's household about these things. So here's Rachel doing the same thing. History, in a sense, is repeating itself, and yet there's going to be some interesting differences. So we have Jacob, part of that Jacob and Esau brotherhood, and not so brotherly brotherhood. And now Jacob is meeting the daughters of Laban, Rachel in particular, but she has an older sister we're going to learn about in just a moment, and that's Leah. So when Laban heard the news of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him, and brought him to his house. And then he related to Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." That reminds me of something that we usually think of, guys and girls, but in other words, your family. And he stayed with him a month. And in that time, he gets to meet the two daughters of Laban. He's already met Rachel. Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak. Now, when we read that her eyes were weak, that's part of a figure of speech. Perhaps it means that she had vision problems. She needed glasses. Or perhaps it was that if you looked at her, you sort of felt like, she was sort of tender on the eyes, hard on the eyes maybe. It's some sort of figure of speech, and it's not complimentary because it's contrasted with Rachel, who was beautiful of form and face. It's said that the reason so oftentimes that guys would prefer beauty over brains is because they can think better, or they can see better than they can think. And that seems to be the case here as well. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 2 speaks about how when Messiah would come, that he has no stately form or majesty that we should look on him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. We're attracted to his character as we get to know him, but it wasn't necessarily because of his good looks. And that's the case between Rachel and Leah. You looked at Leah and you said, and you looked at Rachel and she just blew you away, and then you got to know them both. And I think perhaps you would have quite a different reaction. Now, Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, and he's saying this to Laban, her father, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me." And so Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. This is, instead of a dowry, because he's penniless, he doesn't have any money, so he's going to work as if he's a slave for Laban in order to get Rachel. And we read in verse 20, "And they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her." When you're having fun, time just flies. So at the end of the 7 years, then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my time is completed, that I may go into her." And Laban gathered all the men of the place, and they made a feast. And then what you would do, notice the marriage ceremony. In the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him, and Jacob went into her. And we look at that and we say, didn't he realize? Was the lighting that poor? Part of what happened is that their custom in having a girl come out in public was similar to what my wife and I, this is what you see in this picture below. My wife was the one on the left, and we happened to be in Jordan, and we met this couple, and I asked if I could, take their picture. And this young lady, all we could see was just her eyes. Now, she had great-looking green eyes, but I don't know about any of the rest of her. I couldn't see that. And that's very much like what's happening here. He takes Leah, and they go into a tent, and remember, there's no electric lighting. And so what's happening is Jacob is being, in the same way that Jacob had deceived Isaac, so Laban is deceiving Jacob. Remember, when Jacob had deceived Isaac, it had been because of his vision. Isaac couldn't see very well, and had mistaken him for the older brother Esau. And now Jacob, he can't see very well apparently, in the darkness of the tent, and can't tell that it's Leah instead of Rachel. So it came about in the morning that, behold, like the way the Hebrew says it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this that you've done to me? Was it not Rachel that I served with you? Why then have you deceived me?" And Laban has an excuse. It's not a good excuse. Laban said, "It is not the practice in our place, as you're not in our place. You're in our place, but you're not from our place. It's not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also for the service which you shall serve with me for another 7 years." And so notice the issue is that Rachel's not the firstborn. And of course, the whole reason that Jacob is here is because he's not the firstborn either. Because he has cheated the firstborn in his own family. There's an interesting contrast, and I give credit here to George Sayer, a good friend of mine, just pointing out the difference between Jacob's deception versus Laban's deception. In Jacob's case, Jacob's mother plots to deceive Isaac by regarding the two brothers. In Laban's case, it's Rachel's father who plots to deceive Jacob regarding two sisters. In Jacob's case, Jacob sets out to violate the custom regarding the birth order. In Laban's case, Jacob sets out to violate the custom regarding birth order as well. Now, he wasn't deceiving, he was just, but he wanted to violate that. He wanted the younger daughter. In Jacob's case, Jacob dresses as his brother. In Laban's case, Leah dresses as her sister. In Jacob's case, Jacob deceives Isaac when he cannot see, because in his case he was blind. And in Laban's case, Laban deceives Jacob when Jacob can't see because it's at night and they're in a dark tent. In Jacob's case, Isaac gives the blessing to the wrong brother. In Laban's case, Jacob ends up marrying what he takes as the wrong sister. In Jacob's case, Isaac finds out when it's too late and says that Jacob came with deceit. In Laban's case, Jacob finds out about which wife he's taken when it's too late and asks why he's been deceived, why he's been Jacobed. In Jacob's case, Isaac gives Esau a secondary blessing. In Laban's case, Jacob is given the secondary wife, the wife he really wants. He marries Rachel secondarily. In Jacob's case, the birthright, remember, had already been supplanted. In Laban's case, the custom regarding birth order is actually maintained. Not that Jacob wanted it to be maintained, but it is. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and now they're married as well. And indeed, he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban for another 7 years. Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved. So Jacob's married to these two wives, and one he loves, and one, quite frankly, he doesn't. But he's with both of them, and the Lord sees it, and the Lord opens her womb. But we read that Rachel, by contrast, was barren. What we have next is a series of children being born, first to Leah, and the firstborn is going to be Reuben, and she names him, she says, "Look, I've got a son." And so she names him that, Ben his son, the Rupark, Raya, behold, look a son. And after that she has Simeon, which, remember Shema in Hero Israel, so this is hearing. And then Levi is that idea of attachment. And then finally Judah, she praises the Lord, and that's what Judah means, it means to praise. So their names have meaning, Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah. And by now she has 4 sons, and Rachel has no sons, but Rachel does what Sarah did back when Sarah was barren. Rachel takes her maid and gives her maid to Jacob so that Jacob can have children by that maid, Bilhah. And sure enough, Bilhah has Dan, his name means judgment, and Naphtali, who means wrestle, and it's Rachel's way of sort of, look, God has judged me, and maybe we're wrestling with this, but it's my way of having children, if at least second-hand children. And then Leah gets into that act as well, taking her maid, Zilpah, and giving her maid to Jacob. And so Gad, she has good fortune through him, and Asher just means happy. And finally, Leah is able to now have children again. She's had 4 earlier. So now she has Issachar, that's her reward, and Zebulun means, the abode. And it's only after this that Rachel now has children, and she's going to have Joseph, and eventually, we're not there yet, eventually she's going to have Benjamin. Those will be the last of the male children of this entire line. Now, Jacob, throughout this chapter then, is building a family that will grow and prosper. And as the chapter ends, he's going to be leaving Haran, and he's going to be taking them home. So he's building up this family until he can take them home. And as we're reading this story, remember, it's Moses that's telling the story to the Israelites. And throughout Jacob's story, there's opposition and there's bondage. But Jacob endures and escapes the presence of Laban. And as we read about the opposition and the bondage and the endurance and the escape, meanwhile, Moses, who's telling the story, is telling the story to the Israelites. And those Israelites are going about building a family that are going to grow and prosper until they find their home in the promised land, because they've come out of Egypt and they're looking for a home. So they're reading about Jacob looking for a home, but they're going through the same thing. And in their case, the same thing's happening. There's opposition and there's bondage, but Israel escapes Egypt and finally, after 40 years, goes through the wilderness and finally will find a home after that. As we're reading the story, we need to see in our lives that Jesus is building a family that's going to grow and prosper until he takes us home. And yes, there's bondage. And yes, there's hardship. But eventually, he's going to bring us home.